Hello and welcome. My name is Anamaya Lee. I'm a graduate student at USC and an ISC intern with the SISG group. I welcome you to my Grief 5 Best Practice video series. Today is my fourth interview in this Grief 5 series, and this interview will highlight best practices for educators and key players in the lives of children and teens impacted by parental incarceration. With me today is Zoe Wilmot. Zoe is the Program Manager of Community Works Project What, an organization that raises awareness about the effects of parental incarceration on children with the long-term goal of improving services and policies that affect these children. What stands for We're Here and Talking, referring to the youth who make up the Project What team, as well as the 2.7 million children nationwide who have a parent incarcerated. Project What is a youth-led leadership development program that employs young people from the Bay Area who have had a parent incarcerated as youth advocates. With a background in youth development and a passion for fighting for the rights of prisoners and their families, Zoe first started this work as a youth advocate while in high school when she joined the first cohort of Project What Youth in Oakland, California. Zoe is currently a fellow of the Women's Policy Institute, and one of her most recent achievements is being awarded UC Berkeley's 2014 Mario Savio Young Activist Award for her deep commitment to human rights and social justice and a proven ability to transform commitment into effective action. Zoe, I'd like to thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
So my first question for you is, what are the 5 best practices for working with children and teens impacted by incarceration of one or both of their parents?
Thank you. That's a great question. And parental incarceration, I don't think there's necessarily only 5 answers to this question, but I do have my top 5 that comes from experience, in particular working with youth starting at the age of 13. So there might be different best practices if you're working with younger children, but this is rooted in my experience. And the first one that I want to share with you all is to listen openly without judgment. It might seem like common sense to most people who are educators or social workers or in these fields working with children, but it's particularly important when it comes to children of incarcerated parents because of all the negative messaging there is in the world about incarcerated people and how that flows down to children. So many children of incarcerated parents blame themselves for their parents' incarceration. So when they're opening up and trusting you with their stories and their experiences, that's a really, really important opportunity to see yourself as someone who's not going to judge them in those situations. And so even if a young person is having negative feelings towards their parent or towards another person in their life, you can honor those feelings without yourself speaking negatively about that incarcerated loved one. So if a young person is saying, my father is a terrible father, he messed up, it's okay to hear them and support them, and also to not say later on, your dad is a bad person, your dad is a terrible father, right? Like, you don't want to be perpetuating those messages to that young person. And I think a way to do that is to ask questions about what a young person needs and what they want, as opposed to asking details about their parents' incarceration. So asking if they need support with schoolwork, or if they need a place to live, or what they want in terms of their relationship with their incarcerated parent, as opposed to saying, why was your parent locked up? What did they do? So finding out what a young person needs instead of what happened to get their parent incarcerated is going to help them to feel less judged and listened to. Because most of the time there's no space for children of incarcerated parents to open up about those experiences. So when they do, it's like, you want to honor that space. The second thing that I would say is a best practice for working with this population is to be honest. So much of the time, children have been lied to about their parents' incarceration, or been asked to lie themselves. So it might be that within their family, they know where they are, but when they get to school, they're lying to their friends or to their teachers about why someone who doesn't look like them is picking them up from school, or why there's no one to come at parent-teacher night. They might not even know why their parent is incarcerated. They might be told that they're on vacation or in the military or working away from them. And so as much as possible, when adults in the lives of children of incarcerated parents can be honest, it's going to maintain their ability to see adults as people who are trustworthy. Because if you grow up being lied to over and over again by all the different adults in your life, what happens is you stop trusting adults, and and rightfully so. So being honest with them is the second thing that I absolutely recommend. The third one is to build up a system of support. And this one is something that I have come to know through Project What and realizing that I can't be the only support system for any young person, and no one person can be. And when it comes to parental incarceration, there's so few resources out there and so few people who are willing to listen, to talk, a space to go to be safe. I mean, I first met Anamaya through realizing that there were very few services out there and support services for children of incarcerated parents that exist. And so I recommend really finding out who, you know, on a case-by-case basis, who that young person trusts. If you can do an introduction to someone else in their school. So sometimes I'll just do a case example of a young person who came to us recently who's really struggling with her mental health, and realizing that what we can provide in Project What is good and it's healthy for her, but it's not enough. So when she comes to me for support, not only am I reaching out to other youth in Project What to make sure that she has peer-to-peer support, I'm calling her school counselor who referred her to us to say, hey, with her consent, of course, these are some things that are going on. Are there any other adults in her school that can be supportive? Calling her family and finding out whether it's her mother or another family member, who else can be supportive. So trying to wrap this person with resources and services, and being the person who's introducing them to those things. So it's not just saying, hey, who else can you talk to? You reach out to them. It's who else do you trust? How can I help you reach out to them? Because sometimes even just saying I need help is really, really hard to do. So building a support system around a young person so that you're not the only person holding that information, but also so that they're learning how to build trusting, meaningful relationships with peers and adults in their lives that are rooted in knowing that this person's parent is incarcerated and we're not going to judge you for that experience. So really being open about where they are if they're comfortable with that. The fourth one that I wanted to highlight, which might be one of the most important ones for me in my own experience as a child of an incarcerated parent, is to honor all feelings that a young person has. And again, sort of like the first one around listening openly, it might come as common sense, but when it comes to parental incarceration, I think it's really important to highlight how isolating having a parent incarcerated is. As Anamaya said in my introduction, there's 2.7 million children of incarcerated parents in the United States. But most people have never talked about what it's like to have a parent incarcerated. Overwhelmingly, when youth join Project What, the first thing that happens is they're talking about having a parent incarcerated for the first time in their entire lives. That was absolutely true for me when I joined the program. And so because it's so isolating, there's so many feelings that we're keeping inside. And it's really important to honor those feelings, that regardless of what a parent has done, regardless of what a child has done, every young person has the right to feel how they want to about that parent. Even if the parent committed an awful crime against someone in their family, the child has the right to want a relationship with them. And as an adult, my recommendation is that you do what you can to honor that relationship and to help support them. If there's a court order for no visitation, then help them write a letter if that's going to be healing for them and therapeutic, and obviously with family members' consent. And also honoring that incarcerated people are still people and still parents. So just because whether or not they committed the crime that got them there, there's a lot of systems we could go into forever about why people wind up behind bars and the discrimination that happens. But regardless of what a person has done, they are still a parent, and the child still deserves a right to their parent, and the parent still deserves a right to their child to have a loving relationship with them. So not trying to control those emotions, honoring them, and just as much honoring a child's desire to have no relationship with their incarcerated parent, right? Just really making sure that we're holding those feelings to be true for them and not trying to control them or change them or tell them how to feel. And the last one, this is my favorite, is to remember resilience. And I think this is the thing that I've learned the most from children of incarcerated parents, is that they're not looking for people's pity. They're not looking to be victims. They're not looking to be minimized based on their experiences. They're incredibly, incredibly resilient human beings who have so much to offer, and sometimes just need someone to listen and to offer support, but not to say, I feel so sorry for you, or, you know, just really remembering and looking for challenging them, pushing them, looking for their skills and their strengths and helping to build those up instead of focusing on the negativity and the victimization that can happen once we do open up about these stories in these spaces. I think children of incarcerated parents are some of the most resilient young people you'll ever meet or get the pleasure to work with, and really remember that and honor it. Yeah, so those are my five best for now. Yeah.
Thank you, Zoe.
Mm-hmm.
Can you highlight some similarities and differences you see between the 5 grief experiences of death, divorce, deployment, incarceration, and foster care placement as they pertain to children and teens?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is such a great question, and I love that these 5 experiences are being highlighted side by side. Obviously, my area of experience is around parental incarceration, so that's what I can speak to the most. And when we're talking about parental incarceration, we're talking about an ambiguous loss. So there's not the same finality that comes with the tragedy of losing a parent, right, to death. Ambiguous loss, when it comes to parental incarceration, there's not really a grief process for, because the person is still alive, but they're not in your life the way that they used to be. And you might not have any contact or communication with them, or they might be coming in and out of your life. There's too much variability when it comes to parental incarceration for there to be one grief experience of how that goes. And what we see in Project What is there's this added level of grief when a lot of our youth's parents who were formerly incarcerated also pass away. And so there's an added layer of lack of finality, whether or not they got closure after the parent got out before they passed away. And so I think when we're talking about ambiguous loss, we're also talking about no real space for healing from that trauma. There's not necessarily even a developed curriculum or a set protocol for therapists to follow or mental health care providers to follow. It's just starting to come into that arena of what to do when dealing with an ambiguous loss. I think it's probably similar to that of deployment, where the person is far away, but you don't have contact with them. I think one of the important distinctions to make with parental incarceration is the shame that comes with it. And I think the shame is different from foster care, divorce, deployment, and death, in the sense that as a society in the United States, we very much criminalize any person who's been incarcerated and treat them as if they are less than human and not deserving of redemption or positive qualities, right? It's always like, fantastic that the police caught the bad guy. Even the games that kids grow up playing when they're children, cops and robbers, the idea of like the police are the good guys who are going to lock up the robbers and the people who are committing the crimes, this good and bad connotation, it really impacts young people when they're growing up. It really impacts them to hear all these negative messages about their parent. And it also impacts young people because whether or not it's intentional, a lot of times society treats children of incarcerated parents like they're going to end up like their incarcerated parent, like they are not worthy. So behaviors that are acting out that might, depending on the educator and the environment, but if a teacher knows that a child is dealing with divorce and they're acting out in the classroom, they might handle that differently than if they know that they're dealing with a parent's incarceration, right? Because when a child of an incarcerated parent acts out, more than anything, right, just as any young person who's dealing with challenges or trauma, it's a response to something going on, typically at home. And what it gets met with when it's dealing with parental incarceration is that that's an aggressive behavior that's a further perpetuation of their parents' actions. And that person is going to then be more likely to be incarcerated themselves, as opposed to, what do you need? What's going on at home? What kind of supports do you need? And I imagine that some of those things overlap with these other categories of grief experience, but I think the shame that comes from society is really important, is a really important distinction that really, I think it's one of the most isolating parts of parental incarceration is hearing over and over again in every media source possible, from your friends, from your family, even from the people you love and trust, that your parent is bad is such a harmful thing to hear. Yeah, so I think that's one of the biggest distinctions, but I think when it comes to youth dealing with all five of these experiences, also sometimes they overlap, especially with foster care and parental incarceration. You're much more likely to be in the foster care system if you have a parent incarcerated, and then there's an added loss of all of your family around you being gone when you're in foster care. So I think all of these grief experiences are traumatic, and what happens is, trauma is when you can't deal with the situations that have come forward towards you, um, when you don't have the tools and resources to process harms that have been caused in your life. And so without the right tools and resources, all of these things could be equally traumatizing. And I wouldn't want to necessarily put them against each other as one being worse than the other, but really figuring out what specific things are going on with these young people, which is why I'm so glad you're doing this study of the 5 grief experiences alongside each other and not as separate entities. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say for that one.
Okay, thank you. My last question is, what would you like a teacher to know, or anyone else that's working with children or teens who are impacted by grief and loss due to incarceration of their parent, and or maybe dealing with any of the other 5 grief 5 experiences?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question, and we have unfortunately, a tremendous lack of resources for children of incarcerated parents exists in the United States, but there are a lot of our work is to work with teachers on how, because they're they're a direct responder. Any educator working with young people has the opportunity to do things right, and so often are overwhelmed and undertrained and under-resourced in how to do those things correctly. So one of the things that we always start off with when talking to educators is explaining that the circumstances of a parent's arrest are irrelevant and not to ever ask about them. So if a young person chooses to disclose them to you, that is their choice, but to not ask because it can make them feel judged, even if that's not your intention, even if it's trying to show empathy. And they might not know, and it might bring up a lot of different feelings. And your reaction, whether it's intentional or not, can also impact the young person. Another one is, I think this goes with all 5, is remembering that all kids need one-on-one attention. And that support can look very different, but especially when we're dealing with these 5 grief experiences, the likelihood that they're getting that one-on-one attention at home is greatly decreased for all 5 of these categories. So remembering that if they're not getting it anywhere else, school is such an important place to provide it, and that acting out is probably a response to not getting that attention. Another one that I think is really important is that stress at home can look like a lot of different things at school, right? So it could look like learning disabilities, it could look like ADHD, it can look like violence, it can look like lack of food, it can look like insecurity. All of these things can show up in school-based settings and make young people show up either more driven and more ready to succeed because they have nothing else going on for them at home, or struggling more and not getting support with homework and not getting support in these other areas, not because families aren't loving and caring, but because they're dealing with so much trauma and dealing with so many other things. Typically when a parent is incarcerated, or when a parent is divorced, or when a parent is gone to deployment, you're living in a single parent home. And if there's one or more children and the parent is working to feed all of these children, we're not talking about a parent being able, even if they want to come home and provide that one-on-one attention or help with homework. And then also remembering that whenever possible, just because a family is struggling, doesn't mean it's not worth it to reach out to the parent that is there. It doesn't mean that that parent who's home doesn't deserve to hear how your child is doing, to get check-ins. Don't assume that because the parent is incarcerated or there's a single parent home, that the one who is there isn't providing everything they need to, or that the parent who's away isn't also helping to provide, right? So asking questions, checking in, not rooting yourself in any assumptions about who these people are. And then I think something that's so important for teachers and educators in school-based settings is to be careful about making generalizations about mothers or fathers. This, I think, applies to all of them, making any assumption about who's at home. Because, children need a parent or guardian to sign a permission slip to go on a field trip to school. And so often children of incarcerated parents aren't living with a custodial guardian and don't have the signature of the person who's taking care of them. It's another sibling, it's a grandparent. There hasn't been an official caregiver transfer, the parents in and out of custody or something. And so kids just stay home from field trips because it's too embarrassing to say anything about it. So really working on school policies, even when you're looking at an elementary school and you're doing Father's Day gifts or Mother's Day gifts or like making cards for your parents, thinking about kids who don't have parents and generalizing it, not just to say, if you don't have a parent, make it to someone else you love, but changing the framework. Don't make it a Mother's Day card. Make it a card for someone you love. Like changing up the way that we talk about parent or guardian instead of, that can even be stigmatizing language when you don't have a parent, because how many people identify with the term guardian? Very, very few. And so really thinking about those kinds of activities, providing, readings that deal with where the main characters aren't a child and their two parents. Really making sure that you're showing different forms of what families look like when we're talking about anything. It comes up so often in school-based settings. I'm not asking, is your mom going to pick you up today? Asking who's going to pick you up today? Do you need someone to come and pick you up today? Do you walk home by yourself? Like, those are things to figure out without making those generalizations or assumptions. And then the last one that I want to add for teachers is establishing a right to pass for young people. So something that we see often that comes up in our trainings with teachers is, they build a great relationship with a young person. They have established a trusting relationship and they check in with them on a continuous basis. And then one day the young person comes in and doesn't want to check in. And then the teacher's like, what did I do wrong? What do I need to do? And I think if, sometimes they're having a bad day, or sometimes you did something that makes them not trust you. Or they don't want to talk about their parents' incarceration that day. Even if you talked about it yesterday, doesn't mean that every single day you want to talk about it. So if you can establish a dynamic where you have a right to pass in that situation, where they know that they can say, pass, I don't want to answer that question, is important. And then, sorry, there's one more that just came to mind that's very important, and then I'm done, is that just because a young person opens up to you about their parents' incarceration doesn't mean that they're open to everybody about it. So not telling other adults in their lives at the school without their consent, not calling on them as experts when it comes to parental incarceration. Teachers with the best intention, we see this happen all the time, want to bring in a lesson plan about parental incarceration because they found out that one of their students has a parent incarcerated, which is a great thing to do. But don't point out that student to their whole class without talking to them about it beforehand and each time you're planning on doing it. So just because they're okay to do it once in that moment where you're processing and healing together doesn't mean that 6 months later they want to be that spokesperson. Their lives are changing too much and their relationship with their parents are changing too much to be ready just on the fly to be that spokesperson and deal and talk about it publicly. So those are some of the tips that I have for teachers. There's lots.
Wow, Zoe, thank you so much.
Thank you. This is great.
I so appreciate you, just all the work that you're doing and the impact you're making with this population of youth. And I'd really like to thank you for joining me today for this interview.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And for those of you that are interested, I encourage you to visit notenoughgood.com, where you'll find my blog post entitled It's Grief to Me, Death, Divorce, Incarceration, Deployment, and Foster Care. And in my blog, you'll also find resources for working with grieving children and teenagers. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.